everybody. Is this on? Okay, great. So yeah, hello. I'm Radoslav Stankov, for short Rado. I come from Bulgaria. I have a newsletter called tips at rstankov.com where I wrote basically everything. All my slides are uploaded in speaker deck already because I tend to have a lot of code in my slides, and I noticed that I present some fast and people try to take photos and I switch the slides. So don't worry about it, all the slides are over here. So if you again don't need to rush to make all the photos for the slides, they will be online. So I used to be the CTO of Product Hunt, where we had this architecture, which actually I really liked. I was really happy with this architecture. We had like a Rails backend, we had a GraphQL layer, which was connecting Apollo, Next.js, and it was great. It fit our needs quite well. And when I was at Product Hunt, I started this side project called Angry Building. And I was joking that the goal of the company is to rename the building to Happy Building because everybody who uses it should be happy after that. So this is basically an ERP system for facility management. And it started as a side project. It's something I was doing in my weekends, in my spare time. So when I was starting the system, I put a lot of thought into architecturing it. Like, what are the pieces which I wanted to use? So obviously I want to use Ruby on Rails because I'm really good with that. I like JavaScript, but I didn't want to write a lot of JavaScript because it's harder to test. I didn't want to write a lot of CSS, even though again, I'm very big, I like CSS, but I wanted to try Tailwind. I wanted to have extensive end-to-end test suite, basically, because it's like a business software, it's very important to know work end-to-end. That was also the reason why I removed JavaScript from it. And the big focus of the whole project should be domain. I didn't need to think a lot around like reinventing the wheels and building technologies. So I love Ruby, I love Rails, but there is always one but in the story. So the first thing is, in the Rails folder, when we open a standard Rails project, there is two folders that always, so there is this folder called helpers, which most of you most probably are familiar with. There is this folder named views. And when you think about those folders, this is the thing which gets to my mind. This is how I feel about those. It's like you start pulling a partial, you go to a helper, from the helper another partial, another one, and this is how it feels. And it gets messy very quickly. And for 8 years ago, before, I was doing a lot of React, and I started thinking a lot in terms of component when I built my UIs. So I was fortunate that GitHub released this gem called ViewComponents, which was a system to build components in the view layer. Very smartly named, it's very obvious. So this is the website, this is how the ViewComponents work. They are, if you think, here is an example, if you have, let's say, this field set where you have to enter a bank account. If you think about it, you have a component which is called field set. The field set component have a title and content. And in your Ruby code, what you do is you say, oh, I'm going to render a new instance of my field set component. And it's going to have the form, and the form is going to have the inputs. So this is how the view component is going to look like. You just inherit from view component base. It accepts a title. You add it as an instance variable, and then you have this really nice ERB template, which is your field set, where you can basically make the field set. And where does this content come from? Like, the field set had two things. It has component, it has a text and title. And this content is basically what's the block passed to your view component. So in this way, you have something simple. And that's it. That's the view component. Because we are in the Ruby and Rails world, we are really great with having awesome tools. And view component have these things called previews. And previews basically allows you to render your component in a safe space where you can see how it looks. It's very similar to how when you do mailers, you create your mail template and you can see how your mail looks like. And if you add a gem called lookbook, this is how you get for free, basically. You can browse all your components with their previews, you can check them, and yeah, and stuff works. And you have the achievement. You basically are experts in ViewComponents. That's it. My job here is done, and I have half an hour more. So, I mean, you are an expert, but let's go to the next level. Let's see more, because that's all to it. Like ViewComponents, that's the way you use it. But the thing about it is, the devil is always in the details. And now you have a couple of questions. What goes to the helpers? What goes to my views? What's a partial? What's a view component? And I have this anti-pattern in a Rails app. Like, I really hate when I open a view and I notice this. Just a wall of partials, which, as we learned in the previous panel, it's very slow. And if somebody sees that and say, oh, now we're going to use view components, I'm going to do stuff like that. It's the same. Yeah, it's a bit faster, but still, it doesn't help us. It doesn't help us. So I have this mental checklist of when I'm going to use a view component and where I'm not. Because every tool has its place, and we as engineers need to know when to use one. So the way I use view components is, first, if I noticed group of code that's used between two controllers, I move it into a component, if it's something reusable. If I'm having a view helper that was generating HTML more than like 2-3 lines, I'm also moving it to a view component. If I have complicated if-else logic, like something really deep, where the conventional logic is extract a presenter, decorator, or whatever, I move this to a view component, because the view components are a nice place for you to put logic in that you can actually test. Also, if I have to copy-paste a lot of code, like I noticed I'm pasting this pattern, changing a couple of lines here, I'm making my copy-pasting easier. Also, I'm using view components if I have JavaScript in the mix. Like, as well as we live, we have to do JavaScript at some point. So if I have a component that's connecting to a JavaScript, usually it's something that's reusable as well. So I wrapped it in a view component. So I can, for example, connect it to a stimulus. Or, I mean, I don't use jQuery, but you can imagine jQuery. Where I don't use view components, which I think is important. Like, the first place is I still use partials in one place, and that's underscore form. Like, I can imagine you all created this partial code underscore form, and it's like, okay, there is this form that's basically the same as add and create. It's fine. Like, basically, this is the only partial I use. It works. It's not like a performance bottleneck, and it's fine. It's not like a cardinal sin or anything. Where I use view helpers, I still have like, I think 20 view helpers, and they're basically helpers. Like, I have a function called format money, which doesn't make sense to be a component. It's basically a function that gets a big decimal and formats it into a money. Also, I don't extract view components from messy HTML. I'm fine of having like a very messy HTML in one page, because it's in one page. And if I try to make it clean, it's harder to fix it later. Like, I have this philosophy of like, if I have a messy code, but it works, I just isolate it, I keep the messiness closed, so the next time I see the messiness and I have a better idea how to do it, I do it. So it's isolated. And this is basically my checklist for view components. The way I think about them is, think about like that. You have helpers. Those helpers are used inside of the view components, and view components make domain components, like the UI component and the domain component. So this is another concept which I'm stealing from my React world. where you think about like this. I have a helper called format money, and format money formats money. I also might have a money component where, for example, if it's positive, it's green. If it's negative, it's red. If it's 0, it's blue. It might have some UI. Then I have a product price component where I give it an instance of product and it says, oh, this is the product price. And also it might have like a discount code or something else. But that's how I layer the component logic to myself. What's not here is the header component because it's not reusable, it's for one page. And this is how I structure the components. But I promise you a lot of code. And again, talk is cheap. I can talk you all that theories. And theories are really great. It's very nice to talk about them. But let's see something real. And let's see how we can show you some real code. So the first thing is, I really don't like to do render field set component title. It's very long. So I created this helper called component where you just give it a symbol, you pass whatever. It's basically doing this very simple interpolation. Yeah, it does performance overhead. It's not very slow though, but it works. It haven't slowed my application. And it's a nice, and you would see through my code, I'm just going to use this component helper. Just makes the reading it easier. So this is a real page for my application. It's basically half of my application look like that because it's an ERP system. So it's basically rendering Excel with fancy fonts. So let's break this down. So if you think about it, the app has a couple of components here. It has the navigation, the page header, the filter form, the stats, and the table areas. And those things are components. Navigation component, page header component, filter form component, stats component, and table component. And those are the reusable components. So this is how the page looks like. If you see it fits on one slide, it's very readable. You totally see what I mean. So again, it fits on one slide, technically. And we're on a technical conference. But yeah, let's zoom a bit because let's focus on this part first. So this is one component which basically presents some statistics about the table. I called it the stats component. I'm very good with literal names. So the stats component code, this is the code from the page, looks like that. And let me zoom a bit, just because to make it a bit more visible to you all. And let's focus on the page on the code. This is the stat component. The stats component, again, it uses my component helper here. There is this renders here. It looks like a fancy DSL, but there is nothing fancy here. It's very simple. So if we think about our UI, there is this concept of slots. Like a lot of the more reusable things, like if you make a UI component, often they have those slots, like holes you can put stuff in. And view components have this concept of slots as well. So if you think about the stats component, it's list of smaller stats. It shows you a list of stats, and every stat is its own stats number. And in the future, I might have something else. I can have stats string or whatever. So far, I just have stats numbers. And this is the definition of the stats component. Stats component just have this render many numbers, which is stats number component. And that's the whole code of the whole component. This is the production variant. I haven't removed any sensitive data from here. It's like that. And one thing I do here, I have this alias, number with number, is view components have this thing where you say render many, and render many would give you this method called with number, which would create a new instance of this component. So it makes this DSL. And I don't like with number, it doesn't sound good. So I just alias it to number. So I can say number arguments, and this would create the new instance. Also, again, I have the application component because I put some stuff there. What? We'll see later. The ERB file of this component is very simple. it renders DL, so it's actually even semantically right, and it basically loops to the numbers. And that's it. Renders them and works. The stats number component are a bit more complex. They have so they have these attributes, which is the title, the amount, from, color, link, because we make them clickable, and the component itself just gets those data. And this is most of the components you do are just like that, just initializers. And oops, wrong button. So this is one of the functions in my account application component, which is one of the hacks I have, is I have this fetch with fallback, where I pass the color. And if the color doesn't exist in the list, it's going to capture an exception in my error reporting. In development and test, this is blowing up. In production, it's being clocked, but it renders default things to the user. So I use this hack in a lot of places in my application, where when I build the app, you as developer get all the crap from the app, but the users get the hidden behavior and you trace the notification. So it's a nice strategy if sometimes you need to throw an error to be like a representative, but you don't want the users to know about that. So this is the component, nothing special. Another component on top of that is this filter form. So also from the panel discussion, there was the question about the 20 filters. I also have 20 filters, even more in some places, so much that I needed to build a custom UI for those. And let's see how these components look like. So let's scroll down and let's focus. Here I'm doing something which I call the builder pattern. And what the builder pattern does is I'm making this form component. It's yelling a form object, which is very similar to the form object that we have and laugh and hate in the same time with the form helpers in Rails, where I have custom builder methods where to present what I'm the filter form for. So what I have here is I search by query, I have a select, I have date range. It's basically a simple form. And in my UI, I just define that. And how does this work? So this component is a bit more complicated. Actually, I have implemented this component before I knew slots existed in ViewComponent, because who reads docs nowadays? So I implemented it before slots, and it works well. And I'm not scared to touch it. I'm lazy to touch it. So the way I implemented this is I have two attributes exposed. One is what's the action, which is like the URL, which by default is null. That means it's the same page. And inputs, which is just an array. And I have this small hack before render content. So in ViewComponents, the moment you call content, like the block, this, let me come back. So this block here is only executed when you request the content variable. If you have slots, they are always executed. So this is like one of my hacks to basically render custom builder pattern. If I had slots here, I wouldn't need that. So let's go to all the methods. So my search is basically, my inputs is basically a two-dimensional array, a label plus something. And something is something being rendered as HTML. Here, I'm rendering another search input components. And I'm basically giving the name plus params and yada, yada, yada. The select, I'm just using the normal HTML select from Rails, like the select helper. It's select tag, collection from select, it has a class, if I need the class, and I just ended it. It's just a normal select. I don't need anything more in the future. When I'm less lazy or my business requires me, this select would become some fancy JavaScript select or something like that. For now, this works. And yeah, again, why don't use slots? Because I implemented this before slots and I'm too lazy to change that. Text. Text, again, just input text. Nothing special, nothing fancy. It works. Another trick I have, because my application is multi-language, so it's basically have to work in many languages. I found this hack, and I have this helper calledtlabel. Andtlabel, what it does is it checks if the value is blank, it returns a blank string. It has cases where I need that. If it's a string, it renders it. If it's a symbol, it basically tries to find it in the translation table. And in this way, I can just say, give me a text and a symbol name, and it's going to translate this name into the various languages. So this is like an internalization trick. Date range, I here actually use 2 inputs. I'm a bit cheating. And if I want to have more like a fancy calendar or something, I can replace that at some point. Right now I don't, so I just have this. And the way I render this component is very simple. Just loop through the elements, show the label, and show the input. Nothing more, nothing less. And this is how this component looks like. And the nice thing about this is I have like 10 other methods here, rendering 10 other inputs types. And if I need to change them, if I need to change like the fancy select, the fancy calendar, I have like a very ugly looking amount and searching for money input. If I want to change that to my whole application, make it a bit more UX friendly, I can do it in one place. I don't need to change anything else in my system. My system just is changing in one place. And this is like the level of abstraction where I like to be. So let's go to another place. This thing, the header, like I told you, doesn't make sense to create like a header partial. In this case, there is logic here, so it makes sense for me to make this a component. So how does this look like? So I have a component called page header. I know there is gems for that, and I hate using them for breadcrumbs, so I just got my own breadcrumbs, which is basically an array. So I have this header, and the header had breadcrumbs. And the breadcrumbs accepts various things. Like, for example, if it accepts like a domain object, which is my case building, it knows that it uses the name of the building, proper links, and yada, 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 yada. I have header action, and header actions is those buttons over here. So my whole page header component has 3 things in it. It has the breadcrumb, the page title, and it has these actions. So how is this implemented? I have a couple of slots here. So here I have the slots from breadcrumbs. They're called breadcrumb items because I have a helper called breadcrumbs. I have action slot, which is an action slot. If you notice here, I'm like aliasing with action slots because it doesn't look very well to just actions, which reads better for me. Here, the title, I'm using another of my T-Magic helpers. It's called T-Display. This is like the heart of my internalization system. This is the whole way this thing works. So it basically gets an object and tries to interrogate it into how can I actually display? Well, actually, with switch, this can actually be changed to switch now when I look about it with the new pattern matching stuff. But again, too lazy to change that. And it's a bad thing to think about it on the stage. But yeah, so this thing gets an object and it tries to interrogate it. If you are a symbol, you will be translated. If you are a string, you're going to be displayed. Then if you have this, I call it display name. This is how the world sees you, how you're going to be displayed. And the other one is when I didn't have the display name interface, I used name or title. And again, they have different semantic meanings. So if you have a name, I show you the name. If you have a title, I show you the title. Otherwise, I convert you to string. Maybe I should log an error here, but sometimes there is nulls. So yeah. Another cool trick here is you can access Rails helpers via every view component. So every view component has Rails helpers. And Rails helpers have this content for which you can use to set the page HTML title. It's a nasty hack, not proud of that, but it works really well to sync your header title with the page title. You have it in a single way. Here, oops. Here, another thing I do here is before render, I'm calling this function, I call it infer title, because I started using like, oh, I'll pass a title. I'll pass a title here, I'll pass a title here, I'll pass a title here. And this gets really boring. And I got very tired of that. And I found a formula which is basically the controllers have names and resources have names, and I have internalization system. So what I do is, if you don't give me an explicit title for the page, I'm going to infer it. And I'm going to check if you are an index, you have the name of your index in the translation table, and it's always pages underscore title, whatever, whatever. Otherwise, I'm getting the name, the modularized, and because this is already being translated in for some other reason, I get translated that. So I don't need to deal much with the translations. And this is how the page HTML looks like. And this is very clean HTML. It's nothing more logic, and the whole component removes a lot of area for my app, and all my pages are very consistent. I have everything I want. And how much time more we have? Oh, great. So we get to the big boy, the table component. So the table component is a component where it has a weird history. Before view components, like 10 years ago, I needed to make an admin panels, and I needed tables, and I created a helper which generated tables, and I basically copy pasted this thing for years and just wrap it around like a view component. And right now it's a view component, but it started like basically a view helper. So this is how the table component looks like. You just say component table, you give it a collection, and you can say, and you need to use the build pattern for showing like what column it is, like what are the columns. And a column can be a record, which can be a name, and it uses the property itself of the record being displayed. The record can be an apartment. That means this is like the apartment of this building object. I can get like a block where I built like a custom logic. In this case, I'm showing some documents. I can have dates. I have money. I mean, my application has money. I'm not sure how much money I have, but the application has money. So I have the money component here. And yeah, this is a very nice way to define tables so far. And over the time, I have added various columns. So let's see how this is implemented. Also, one thing to notice here is I'm using components inside of components. So for example, I have a component named a badge component. And this is a component that renders like a badge, which is basically a half a circle with like different colors. And I have this component with a very unique name called, let me read it because it's transaction kind badge component, which it's very grabbable if you need to replace it, which gets a transaction and knows what kind of badge it can render to this transaction. Imagine in other application that transaction can be pending, transaction can be failed, positive, negative. You can add a lot of business logic and hide that business logic to how to display in single place. One thing where I used helpers is I like the code to look nice. So for buttons, I have my button component, and I actually extracted this very recently. Before, for buttons, I just had like a button helpers, but I just have those helper methods because it was kind of unnatural to write component, button, whatever, and to do like component compared to like just say, okay, button action. Also, one advice to everybody. If you're making a new system, and it's very tempting when you make a UI system to start to extract components from component named button. Leave the button component last. Like button components are one of the most used components in your apps. A lot of opinions about the buttons, and there is a lot of variants of the buttons. So don't over-extract button components. Like the worst component you can start your design system from is a button, because there are too many of them, and there will be too many of them. So most of the time you need to extract a button, not implement a button and then use it. Just friendly advice. You'll thank me later. The table component. Table component just have two fields, records and columns. And here I have two things. One is for formatting money and formatting dates. And the initializer just receives a list of records, and it creates an empty columns array. I have my before render hack. And this is how the columns look like. So every column is just a plain Ruby object called table column. It's that accepts name, classes, format, which is something that you can call on. So basically a function. Helpers, which are the Rails helpers for rendering whatever. And if it's a block, I'm just bypassing the block. So this is every column. So with this method, you can implement everything in this table. So all my helpers are just using this thing. I can say column, name, number, class number. Why do I need class for number? Because you want all the numbers to be on one side and be always sorted. Why I want it for time? Because there was something for time. And I want to say, okay, I format the time. Record is a bit more complicated. With record, what I do is I'm getting the record and I'm saying, okay, this attribute name, the second argument here is the attribute name, and I'm getting one of the properties of the record and I'm trying to find the link for it. I'm using my friend tDisplay here. I have this helper called routes record path, which basically for every record in my domain system can render a route. And here is where the itself hack works. So in Ruby, every object has a property called itself, which returns itself. So I don't know if it's meant for users like mine to be able to say, oh, my attribute is itself, so it renders the class, but it works. So yeah, the record is a bit more complicated, and the table column, it's actually quite short, and that's the whole code. I think I removed 2 comments here because I forgot what they were, for what the code was. So again, I'm just getting a lot of properties, and I have 2 methods. Render header, which renders me the header of the table, and I have a render cell, which is the whole logic where you basically render all the cells. So render cells does some voodoo magic to get the block contents. It uses tDisplay to do a lot of stuff, but again, it's something that you do once. And the table itself, it's a lot simpler. You just loop through the columns, and for each column you use the column thingy to render either the header, either the cell, and if it has pagination, you show the pagination. If it doesn't have pagination, you don't do it. So notice this works with active record associations, it works with paginated things, it works with arrays. So it's like a very simple grid table, nothing fancy. And over the time, again, I changed its implementation. So yeah, that's the whole system and how it works. I wanted to show you some real code of ViewComponents because they're very simple. Like when you become expert for like 5 minutes, and this could have been the whole presentation. But I think there is value of like showing stuff in real life, like the dirty stuff. Like, yeah. So yeah, thank you. This didn't start well. Yeah, the slides are here.
Thank you, Rado. Do we have any questions?
Thanks. Do you have experience with React, and what is your attitude to it?
Oh yeah, I mean I have plenty of experience with React. I used to organize
Can
the
you
conference.
compare this solution with React and your feelings about it?
So they're very different. Like they have different value propositions, in my opinion. Like I have for this company, I have a mobile app which is React Native, which is a very good, like the same way ViewComponents was a great solution for the backend, React Native was a great solution for the mobile experience. So they are, in my opinion, you need to think about what interactability your application needs and what is the trade-offs. Like, for example, when I was in Product Hunt, we used Next.js with React. If I use ViewComponents with the Rails way there, I would hate myself. If I use Next.js with React for Angry Buildings backend, I would have hate myself. Like there is this balance of, is your application needing these technologies? Can your applications take the constraints and the disadvantages of these technologies? Because everything is a trade-off, and you have to think about each technology comes with its benefits. Hopefully it has benefits, and it has its drawbacks, and you need to kind of balance that. In these cases, like my previous company and this company, they were totally different products. The interactability model were very different, and the teams, the constraints were very different. And again, I can talk for hours why one is better, but come to me afterwards. I give more.
Okay, any other? Okay.
So one of the advantages often presented for ViewComponents is testability. I'm interested in your experience. Do you tend to heavily unit test your ViewComponents, not? And what your thoughts are?
Yeah, so it's advantage for testing. What I don't do unit tests, I do smoke tests. So let me show you this. As I mentioned, ViewComponents have this awesome feature called previews, which, oh my God, this was too long, guys. How did you? So Lookbook, like you make those previews. So for most of my components, I have those previews that work like Mail's previews. Lookbook, like ViewComponents, renders those in a page. So what I do is capybara test that goes to each of those pages, opens it, and makes sure it doesn't blow up. And this is well enough for me because I have end-to-end tests for all the business logic and all the business functionality. So I know stuff functionally works. I have most of the logic in my components. If it's something more complex, it's moved to like a business service object or whatever. And I make sure I have smoke tests for those things don't blow up. Usually what's more useful is having this lookbook where I can check, oh, how does this look with this variant of UI, with this variant of UI, with this variant of UI. If I was making like a real library, I would have, this would be a nice way to do like visual tests where I render, make a screenshot and apply, but I don't need that.
Okay, any other questions? All right, let's take a break. But first, let's give an applause to Rado. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great presentation.